It is one of the most fundamental assumptions in the entire history of human science. For over a century, researchers across the world agreed on a single defining boundary of early human life. Our ancient ancestors could survive in the open. They could master the grassland, the coastline, and the semi-arid plains of Africa. But the rainforest was different. The jungle was considered the one environment on Earth that early Homo sapiens were simply not equipped to conquer. Too dark for tracking prey, too dense for spotting predators, too hostile for the kind of survival that science believed our ancient ancestors were capable of. And for more than 100 years, that assumption went unchallenged. Then, in 2025, a team of scientists published findings in the journal Nature that shattered it entirely. Inside a West African jungle, buried beneath 150,000 years of forest sediment, they found the tools of early humans, living in a place that science had always said was impossible for them to survive. What those tools revealed does not simply add a new chapter to the human story, it rewrites the foundation on which that story was built. This was not a small correction to an old theory. This was not scientists quietly adjusting a date by a few thousand years. This was the complete dismantling of one of the most deeply held beliefs in the entire history of human science. For more than a century, the story of where we came from had one central truth. Our ancestors survived in the open, in sunlit spaces, on ground. They could read and understand. The jungle was the one place they could not reach. And now, that truth has been overturned. To understand why this discovery has shaken the scientific world, we need to understand what scientists believed before it changed. The story of early Homo sapiens has always been told through geography. Our species first emerged in Africa around 300,000 years ago, and for decades, the evidence consistently pointed in one direction: open environments, savannas where enormous herds of animals could be tracked across long distances, coastlines where fish and shellfish were abundant and accessible, semi-arid landscapes where movement was easy, and the sky was always visible. These environments shared a single critical quality: visibility. On an open plain, a human being can spot a predator from hundreds of meters away, can read the landscape for water, can track prey across a vast horizon. The tropical rainforest offered none of that. Sight lines collapse to just a few meters. The canopy above locks out the sun completely. The air is thick and humid beyond anything a modern person would find comfortable. The ground is permanently wet, and every shadow in every direction hides something that might kill you. This was not just an assumption, it was the scientific consensus, built on a century of evidence and fieldwork, and for a very long time, it seemed. Completely unbreakable. Before this discovery, the oldest confirmed evidence of any human being living inside a true African rainforest was just 18,000 years ago. 18,000 years, not 1,800, not 18 million, 18,000. Compare that to the full 300,000-year history of our species, and you begin to understand what that number actually means. It means that humans had only very recently, and apparently very reluctantly, entered the jungle at all, long after agriculture, long after complex tools of extraordinary sophistication, long after nearly everything we associate with human intelligence and complexity had already appeared on Earth. Even the oldest global record for rainforest occupation anywhere in the world came from Southeast Asia at around 70,000 years ago. So the science was clear. Rainforests were late arrivals in the human story, not the birthplace of anything significant, not the site of any great evolutionary moment, just a place that our ancestors eventually, and reluctantly, moved into once everything else had already been mastered. And then, a forgotten site in West Africa proved all of that. Completely wrong. The story does not begin in 2025. It begins in 1982 in southern Côte d'Ivoire, a country on the western edge of Africa. A young Ivorian archaeologist named Professor Yodé Guédé was leading one of the most ambitious excavations his country had ever seen, a joint Ivorian-Soviet research mission at an archaeological site called Bête Ivoire, located near the town of Anyama, on the edge of one of West Africa's last remaining stretches of ancient rainforest. His team dug a trench, 14 meters deep, into the forest floor, layer by layer, season by season. They descended through time, and they found tools, dark, heavy, finely worked stone tools, buried deep inside the sediment, buried in layers that had not seen sunlight in a very long time, buried in soil that smelled of damp earth, and something older than anyone could yet prove, something intelligent, had been here, something with the knowledge and the skill to shape stone with purpose. But in 1982, the technology needed to determine Exactly how old those tools were simply did not exist. And so the site and its secrets waited. The tools were cataloged, the photographs were taken, Professor Guédé's records were carefully filed away, and the world of science moved on for decades. The site sat silent. Then in 2014, a scientist named Eleanor Seri, based at the Max Planck Institute of Geoanthropology in Germany, began assembling a research team with one specific and daring goal: to find the oldest evidence of human life in West Africa, and to finally answer a question that no one had yet managed to answer. What were our ancestors truly doing in the periods of time that science still could not reach? Seri's team found Professor Guédé's records, found his original excavation notes from the Ivorian Soviet mission, found the photographs of those dark stone tools lying deep in the forest sediment, and what they saw stopped them cold. Those tools, buried at that depth in that specific environment, should not have existed. According to everything that the science of human origins believed at that moment in history, they were impossible. In March 2020, the team arrived in Côte d'Ivoire. They cleaned back the original trench, prepared their sampling equipment, and began collecting sediment from the deepest layers. And then the world shut down. COVID-19 closed every international border. Within days, James Blinkhorn, the team's field director, described what followed in terms that still feel almost cinematic. By 2 p.m, he said, they were already fighting through heavy traffic near Abidjan. By 7 p.m, they were at the airport, waiting to fly home. One morning, that was all they had. The sediment samples they had collected during those few desperate hours were sealed, packaged, and carried out of the country as the world was locking down around them. And then something happened that no one had anticipated. Between 2020 and 2021, an aggregates quarry expanded across the land where Bete Thorman had stood. The 14-meter trench that Professor Guédé had spent a decade excavating was bulldozed into rubble. The original stone tool collection had already been lost years earlier. During Côte d'Ivoire's civil conflict in 2011, the samples from that single morning in 2020 were now the only physical record that Bete Thor had ever existed. Back in the laboratory in Germany, the real science began. The team applied 2 completely independent dating methods to the quartz grains extracted from those sediment samples. The first was optically stimulated luminescence, OSL. This technique works like a clock, buried in the earth. When quartz grains are sealed underground, they absorb tiny amounts of energy from the natural radioactivity in the surrounding soil. When those same grains are exposed to controlled light inside a laboratory, they release that stored energy as a faint but precisely measurable glow. The intensity of that glow tells scientists exactly how long those grains were buried. In the dark, the second method was electron spin resonance, ESR. It works on the same fundamental principle, but reads trapped electrons inside the crystal structure of the quartz. Using a magnetic field rather than light, it is a different process, an independent process, and it is particularly well suited for materials that date back hundreds of thousands of years. The team ran both methods on the same quartz grains from the same layers, deliberately using one as a cross-check on the other when the results came back. From the laboratory, the room went quiet. The deepest sediment layer, the one directly associated with those ancient stone tools, dated to 146,000 years ago, plus or minus 9,000 years, not 18,000, not 70,000, 146,000 years ago, more than 8 times older than the previous African record for confirmed rainforest occupation, more than double the previous global record from Southeast Asia. And the sediment layer, directly beneath the tool-bearing deposits, the ancient ground they rested on, came back at 166,000 years ago. These people had not stumbled into the jungle by chance or desperation. They had been here long before the last ice age began. But dating the tools was only half the question. The other half was just as critical. Was it actually a rainforest back then? Because if those tools were ancient, but the forest itself was a recent development, then the story changes completely. Scientists needed to establish, with the same certainty they had about the dates, exactly what the environment looked like 150,000 years ago at that precise location, and what they found in the sediment was extraordinary. Buried in the same layers as the tools were fossilized pollen grains, phytoliths, which are microscopic silica skeletons that survive in soil long after every leaf and branch, has rotted into nothing, and ancient plant wax residues, chemically preserved in the earth for 150,000 years. Pollen from trees and canopy vegetation made up between 82 and 96% of every identifiable plant signature found in those layers. Grass pollen, the defining biological signature of open savannas and grasslands, was strikingly low, almost entirely absent. But the most remarkable piece of evidence came from something far smaller and far more specific. Inside those same tool-bearing layers, the researchers found the actual anthers of a humid forest tree known as Hunteria, not just the pollen, but the tiny flower structures that produce the pollen. This distinction matters enormously. Pollen can blow in the wind. It travels hundreds of kilometers from where the plant actually grows. It lands in places the original tree never existed. It is the least reliable indicator of what was truly present at a specific site. Anthers do not blow anywhere, they fall, straight down. They exist, only where the tree itself was physically standing. Finding Hunteria anthers directly inside the layers that held the stone tools was not a suggestion, it was a confirmation. A dense, humid, closed-canopy West African rainforest was growing in this exact location, while someone was kneeling on the ground beneath it, shaping stone with their hands. And this is where the story becomes truly unsettling. Because the rainforest is not simply difficult to live in, it is actively hostile to human survival in ways that are difficult to appreciate. From the outside, the canopy seals out the sun. Sight lines collapse to just a few meters in every direction. Leopards, forest buffalo, venomous snakes exist at densities far greater than on the open savanna, and they are almost impossible to detect. Until they are dangerously close, large prey animals, the kind that provide the high-calorie payoff that makes a hunt worthwhile, are scattered, hidden and far more difficult to track than anything that moves across open ground. Many plants in the understory are toxic, without specific knowledge of how to prepare them safely. And then there is malaria, a study published in April 2026 in the journal Science Advances by a team including researchers from the Max Planck Institute of Geoanthropology, confirmed that malaria has been actively shaping where humans could safely live in sub-Saharan Africa for at least 74,000 years. The regions of lowest malaria risk were consistently the regions of highest human habitation. The rainforest was not simply a hard place to live. It was one of the most lethal environments on the face of the planet. So how did they survive? How did a group of early Homo sapiens 150,000 years ago, without agriculture, without medicine, without any of the technologies we associate with mastery of a difficult environment, manage to live and apparently thrive inside one of the deadliest places on Earth? The answer is written in the tools themselves, the stone picks. Recovered from the deepest layers of Beteae, belong to a tool-making tradition that archaeologists call the Sanguan, a toolkit found across Central Africa and associated specifically with human populations that were adapted to forest environments. These are not the lightweight, precisely shaped instruments of grassland hunters. These are heavy, robust, purposeful tools. Tools designed for cutting through dense vegetation, for working and shaping wood, for digging into the ground, for processing the specific, and demanding resources that only a rainforest provides. These people were not refugees driven into the jungle by disaster or desperation. They were not lost travelers who had wandered off the savannah. They were adapted, deliberately and purposefully adapted. Someone had taught them the jungle, and they had mastered it. The study published in Nature in February 2025, and confirmed by a series of follow-up investigations throughout 2025 and into 2026, does not simply update a date in a database. It forces an entirely new question about who we are and where we truly came from. If Homo sapiens were already living inside rainforests 150 years ago, then the story of where our species evolved is far more complex, far more extraordinary, and far more widely distributed across the African continent than any existing textbook has ever captured. Eleanor Scarry calls this the Pan-African mosaic, the idea that our species did not emerge from a single place, adapted to a single environment, shaped by a single set of challenges and pressures. Instead, different groups of early Homo sapiens were evolving simultaneously across the entire African continent in radically different habitats, building radically different skills, solving radically different problems, and occasionally meeting and exchanging genes and knowledge that further accelerated what each group could do. One group of our ancestors learned to read the open savanna, another mastered the coastline and its resources, another survived the edges of the desert. And now we know that 150,000 years ago, another group was walking beneath the canopy of a West African jungle facing challenges that no other species had ever successfully confronted, that ecological flexibility, that extraordinary capacity to adapt to any environment on Earth did not appear suddenly. When our ancestors left Africa for the first time, it was built here, long before they left, in habitats like this that science is only now beginning to find. But the mystery does not end there. Eleanor Scarry herself has said she would not be surprised if future research pushes this rainforest timeline even further back, the samples from Beteae, were collected from layers above the deepest undated sediments in that trench. What lies below them, in the ground the quarry destroyed, before anyone could reach it, may never be recovered. But Bétea was not the only site. There are other locations in Côte d'Ivoire, identified by Professor Guédet and his team, that have not yet been fully excavated. Other layers, other tools, other buried records of a time, and a people and a story that science has not yet even begun to read. The jungle still holds its secrets, and somewhere, inside that green darkness, the oldest chapter of the human story may still be waiting to be found. Thanks for watching. If you found this discovery as remarkable as we did, leave a comment below with what surprised you most, like the video, and share it with someone who believes they already know where humans came from. Until the next discovery,